Good evening, everyone. My name is Connor Moran. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Book Festival. Thank you so much for joining us tonight as we welcome Jessie Daniels for her book, Nice White Ladies. Jessie, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Um, it is actually our pleasure, but I will start at the beginning, as I always do, by thanking Madison Public Library, the Madison Public Library Foundation, and all of our sponsors. Their unwavering support of free cultural events like this for the last 9 years, and most definitely throughout the pandemic, has been a real bedrock for many of us across Wisconsin, across the country, and tonight across the globe. So thank you all, wherever you're watching from, for being here to hear Jessie talk about her newest book. I also just want to mention we have about 3 more events for our fall schedule at the Wisconsin Book Festival next week. We have the author Neal Stephenson for his book Termination Shock. We also have an incredible poetry collection by 2 of the University of Madison first wave poets. And that one's on Tuesday, and Neal Stephenson will be on Saturday. And then we have one more event on December 2nd here virtually on Crowdcast. Please visit wisconsinbookfestival.org to find out about all of those events. Well, Jessie, it is my honor to welcome you tonight. For those people at home who don't know, Jessie is the author of this book, Nice White Ladies. She's also the author of White Lies. She is a faculty affiliate at the Harvard Berkman Klein Center of Internet and professor at Hunter College, the Graduate Center at SUNY in Sociology, Critical Social Psychology, and Africana Studies. She is also an internationally recognized expert on internet manifestations of racism, and now she is a internationally recognized author writing about many of those manifestations. So Jessie, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Yeah, pleasure. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah. I want to kind of just start tonight right where you start in your book. The first line is, you say, "Nice white ladies and our protection are fundamental to American culture." I went to law school once upon a time, and we could sit and talk about each of those words and, what does nice mean and ladies mean. And
Right.
but I wanted to begin about, how does that interplay work between nice white ladies and their protection becoming ingrained in American culture?
Yeah, that's a great question, and part of the reason that I start the book with the note with this idea about our protection is because I really see it as built into kind of the foundations of the country. And so part of the way that I got interested in this topic was when I was in graduate school. I was reading about lynching, which I grew up in Texas, and I went to Texas public schools my whole life, and I had never once in K through 12, and certainly not even in my undergraduate career, learned about lynching. And I learned about it in graduate school. And part of what I learned, I started reading the work of Ida B. Wells Barnett,
Sure.
who was a journalist and sometimes sociology claims her as well. And she was documenting lynching, and also documenting how often it was that white women were kind of put out front as the excuse for lynching, right? For this
Sure.
brutal, violent torture of Black people.
Yeah.
And when I was in graduate school, I was in gender and women's studies classes, but we weren't really talking about that view of white women. So it just sort of set off this series of questions for me
Sure.
about how white women were viewed in the culture.
Yeah.
And I began to see that sort of white women's protection and comfort is sort of the kernel of so much that's wrong with the society right now in terms of the legal system and sort of culture and the way that we think about race and gender.
Yeah, it's so interesting you say that about the way that white women are depicted, because often in what I've seen much more recently, I would say, in those images of lynchings is incredibly elated white people for about what they've done.
Right,
And often it's women.
right.
It's something that you would maybe say is
Right.
like, not for mixed company or something like that. But
Right.
it definitely
No,
wasn't.
that's definitely one of the things that's just sort of been haunting for me is those photographs from lynching,
Yeah.
right? Because when you do that sort of pan back and you look at the faces in the crowd, those could be my relatives. When I look at those photos,
Yeah.
it's just like,
Yeah.
oh, I see people I could be related to. Now, I just want to be clear, I didn't discover any of those photos in doing this research, where it was my family standing there, but it totally could have been, and so that's kind of what I'm trying to get at.
Sure. Yeah. I think that the next sentence that you have was really an incredible jump shift for me as well, after talking about how important nice white ladies are and their protection is to America, you say, and this fact is destroying us. How did you begin to understand that fact
Yeah.
and conceptualize that?
Yeah. I mean, even beyond, what's going on in this country, there's lots of research which points to the centrality of white women going back through colonialism as well. But but to bring it back to more contemporary events, just last year on May 25th, 2020, most people who are here listening to this will remember that was the day that George Floyd was murdered, under the knee of a cop who looked right back at the camera in this kind of defiant way. It was also the very same day that the controversy happened a few blocks from where I live in Central Park here in New York City. A woman named Amy Cooper, who got dubbed Central Park Karen, right? She tried to
Yeah.
call the police on a black man who had simply asked her to follow the rules in Central
Right,
Park
to leash her
to
dog,
leash her
right?
dog.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And we all saw that video of her calling 911. There's an African American man threatening me. She throws her voice half an octave, and it's quite chilling. And I think that the fact that those two things happened on the same day, just in the last year, to me speaks to the way that this mythology of nice white ladies that we're so in need of comfort and protection gets brought into the contemporary moment, and it is destroying all of us. So it potentially could have destroyed that man Christian Cooper, who Amy Cooper
Sure.
called the police on. But more than that, I think it's destroying us as well as white women, as white people, because James Baldwin had this great line that white people begin to believe in their safety as no child believes in their safety. And I think that we've bought into this kind of mythology that we're somehow, removed from the rest of society, and that's sort of why we should be able to call 911 when someone asks us to follow the rules.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about Karen's in a little bit, but that, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that experience and that reality, I mean, runs through this book so often.
Mm-hmm.
The
Yeah.
assumption that the system works for me because I'm white, the
Yeah.
assumption that whatever my take on a situation is the correct one because I'm white. That comes up
Mm-hmm.
so very often. And are you seeing
Yeah.
that? Maybe you can give some of the people viewing at home some examples of how is that reinforced? How is that um, certainty, I guess, reinforced by
Yeah.
just the way white people have structured American culture?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there is a way in which, our word gets taken at face value, if you will, to use a bad expression maybe. But our, like, in court, when white people are testifying, it's like it's taken as, true, and our accounts are not questioned in the same way
Yeah,
that other people's accounts are. So I mean, I think that's one
yeah,
way, but I mean, it's also the fact that one of the things I talk about in the book is the whole 911 system, is actually created out of, the Kerner Commission report was sort of trying to, how are we going to deal with this political unrest that's happening? And so there was this notion that there should be a way to call police more quickly, but it's also the case that that was um, the push for a universal call system was really um, advanced by the murder of Kitty Genovese, who was a white woman who was killed here in New York City in the 1960s, and
yeah,
she was attacked and killed by a black man. And there was a way in which her murder was sort of seen as, a kind of clarion call for swifter police response to things, and that really is about making us who are white feel like the state is at our beck and call, and we can
yeah.
just
Disposal for
summon
sure.
them when we're inconvenienced, basically, like you would call a concierge at a hotel.
And often it is that flip or that that
Yeah.
off the cuff. I definitely
Yeah.
can hear that, see that. Um, One of the other issues that you raise, and this is very early on in the book, is the idea that people bring up to you all the time, that talking about whiteness, just talking about the fact of whiteness, is divisive. And I think, we can see that in so many aspects of the news,
Yeah.
daily life in the news with critical
Yeah,
race
yeah,
theory,
yeah.
or here in Wisconsin with the details
Mhm.
of the Kyle Rittenhouse trial in Kenosha,
Yep.
which, those are
Yep.
prominent examples. But I
Yeah.
would challenge anyone to think about everyday interactions with coworkers or family members or bumper stickers
Yeah.
that drive you crazy. Um, so, what have you learned about how talking about race and racism affects any of those interactions, or the way that we perceive the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting phenomenon, right? That we that we're sort of in this country where there's so much happening about race.
Yeah.
I mean, there's something in the news every single day about this, and yet, when you want to have a conversation and say, we white people also are racialized, like that whiteness is a race, and the minute you talk about it, people lose their minds and start, "What are you talking about? Why are you attacking me?" And I really believe that we have to get to a point where we can have these conversations and just say, yeah, we who are raised to be white have some kind of stake in this
Yeah.
conversation about race, And I think that, I mean, there's a particular thing that happens, around talking about white women in particular. Um, there was just recently in the first part of October, there was a New York Post article about I think it was actually a bookseller association was having some kind of a training or diversity seminar for white women. And the New York Post just kind of, had a big headline about it. And they put the image of the flyer for the workshop in the press. And they were like, this is outrageous. And you could never sort of get what the objection was. It was just like, oh my God, they're talking about white women, and isn't that terrible? And then 2 days later, David Brooks at the New York Times picks up that exact article from the Post,
Yeah.
links to it in his New York Times op-ed, and says, this is crazy. People having workshops for white women as if all white women are the same. And of course, no one's saying that.
Sure, of
But it
course.
makes
I
for
mean,
a
and
very
that's
useful straw man argument, right?
yeah, that's what we hear though about all sorts of other races as well, right? Latinos
Mm-hmm.
don't vote as a bloc, or Asia is,
Right. Right.
encompasses so many different cultures, and of course that's true, and so of course I don't think we're talking about all white women being the same, but we can,
Right.
talk about some traits that are based on data that you can provide. Yeah.
Right, right.
Um,
I guess the other thing that happens when I try to talk about white women is that there's often a real defensiveness on the part of white women themselves. Who are like, oh, this is just trying to silence women or something. And absolutely not what I'm trying to do. I'm really
sure.
trying to have a more thoughtful conversation about our role in the world.
Yeah. Well, you said something that, I think people hear this a lot, or you listen to a radio show and people don't have enough time, and I'm sure we don't have enough time. We only have whatever it is, 47 more minutes, but you said we have to get to a point where we can talk about it. Do you have
Mm-hmm.
do you have any I don't even know, tips, let's say, or approaches that people can do to get themselves, it's not even necessarily about the conversation, but getting myself to a point where I can sit in my whiteness and understand it and deal with the
Yeah.
many facets that it brings to my life, and then be able to talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, one of the things that I learned, and one of the kind of embarrassing and true stories that I share in the book, is that when I was growing up, I believed that I was Cherokee because my father had a belief that he was
Yeah.
Cherokee. And so, and that was just the stories that I was raised with. He told me about the Trail of Tears, the forced removal of people from Georgia, Cherokee people from
Yeah.
Georgia who had marched through the long winter of 1838-39 to Oklahoma, as if our family had been on that
Yeah.
march. We weren't. But what that did for me was it gave me this kind of remove from whiteness. Like, I didn't grow up thinking, oh, I'm white and that's an identity that I need to defend.
Uh-huh.
It was actually very late in life, when I was in my 20s, that I started reading Ben Deloria's Custer Dive for Your Sins. And I was like, oh, not only am I not Cherokee, but I'm a bit of a cliche. um,
Yeah, I actually know
but
like a number of people who've
yeah,
found that, thought
yeah,
that,
it's
gone to college on scholarships that weren't for them, all
right.
sorts of different things.
Well, right. I mean, that's part of what my dad was encouraging me to do, but I didn't. I
Sure.
didn't do that
Sure.
anyway. But I mean, I think for me, so from that lesson of sort of my detachment from whiteness and coming to it sort of late, it gave me a little space to be able to examine whiteness like this thing that it is, which is a, in sociology we say a social construction. It's a made-up category,
Sure.
rather than completely identifying with it, and sort of trying to hold on to it. So I think that when people are uncomfortable with these discussions about whiteness, my tip or my strategy would be to just take a breath and think about why that makes you so uncomfortable. What is it
That's
about
very
the conversation about whiteness that's so, it makes some people really angry, it makes other people really just uncomfortable? Like, what is that? And I think that what people will discover is that at some level they're attached to that identity of whiteness. And I
yeah,
think the more that we can sort of let go of that, like, oh, that's not who I actually am.
right.
That's this thing that's been constructed. Now, how do I think about who I am in relation to that? So I
Yeah.
think that detachment is kind of the key.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense, and it's very powerful, right? I mean, once you start looking at it and say,
Mm-hmm.
oh wait, if those things are true, then this and this in my life
Right.
might be based on that. Yeah, it is very,
Right. Exactly.
it's
Exactly.
looking in a very clear mirror, and
Yeah, it's also really powerful. I mean, one of the things that I try to get across in the book, and I do in my lectures, is to say, whiteness shapes our lives in lots of ways. But those of us who are raised white, who are raised to believe that we belong in that category, we're often not very practiced at noticing it, right? So
yeah,
it takes some learning, it takes some skill to begin to pay attention to it and sort of go, oh, I see, that's whiteness. But it's totally something people can learn to do. But I think it's sometimes frightening for people, because it's like, what if I begin to examine this identity and there's nothing left for me at the end of that process? And I mean, kind of the point of the book is, it's fine, it's fine. Come on through to the other side.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's important to have that kind of example though of people
Hmm.
who are working on that, even though we may never actually get to the other side, but we got to go in the
Hmm.
direction, right? I mean,
Right,
um,
right, exactly.
that reminds me, what you're saying reminds me of another comment you make, which is that whiteness operates unconsciously, and you actually use it to mean a number of different things. But the immediate place that I
Hmm.
went was um, how that kind of unconscious whiteness leads to the creation of like default cultural assumptions. I'm
Hmm.
thinking about something like the popularity of Seinfeld or Friends, which, when you start to
Hmm.
look at it, is a very white show about largely white situations with largely white
Hmm.
people. Or, you'll read a book and it'll say something like a man and an Asian woman faced each other on the subway, and you're set up to believe that that man is white, and they would,
Hmm.
they'll identify any number of other indicators about other people, but
Yeah,
rarely will it be whiteness. So
yeah.
how do you see that kind of default assumption sitting in our culture, and what can white people do to kind of take ourselves out of the center, or start to,
Hmm. Hmm.
not have that assumption take over in certain settings?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of ways in the culture that whiteness gets to be the default and the assumption. I mean, and it becomes really hard to sort of name it, right? I think one of the examples I talk about in the book, and I think is just to me one of the most obvious ones, is if you think about, I mean, you mentioned television shows, but I think about like magazines, like the cover of what is it, Vanity Fair. They have a
Yeah.
Hollywood issue every year, and that often has, the actresses who are going to be nominated for the Oscars or whatever. And it's just this sea of white actresses. But, and there's, occasionally an Angela Bassett or a, Kerry Washington or a Lupita Nyong'o who are
Mm-hmm.
in those spreads as
Yeah,
well.
I
But
think we've all seen
often, yeah, that's not the main focus of it. And there's a way in which that kind of, whether it's Seinfeld or Vanity Fair or whatever, there's a way in which white people are the center, and yet it doesn't get named. And especially with white women, like the Hollywood issue, or
that. Yeah.
Sex in the City or HBO's Girls or whatever. And I think that we have to begin to start to name whiteness when it happens, to name, when characters in stories are white and that is relevant, to name that. And I think that there needs to begin to be a little more equity in naming characters, just like the example you were giving. Instead of just saying that, assuming that the default is whiteness, go ahead and name that. Like,
Yeah.
what kind of whiteness?
Yeah.
Because there are different flavors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
So,
I think that's really interesting, as you were saying about especially how it relates to white women. You
hmm
know, because there is also a narrative that, well, the cover of Vanity Fair for Hollywood for 70 years was only men,
hmm
and really
right,
only white men. And
right,
so
right.
I think that I know that in some conversations, and you talk about it in your book quite a bit, like there is a valid, this is, it's my turn now. And
Yeah.
so the interplay between gender-based feminism and
hmm
intersectional feminism is very
hmm
real, and they, you know, they can bump up against each other,
hmm
and how do you see that playing out? How do you see?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I let me start over. when I was in when I was first encountering feminism, it was again pretty late in life. It was in my 20s, and the kinds of classes and books that I was reading really focused on a kind of what now we would refer to as a kind of binary, right? There was sort of
Yeah,
men on this side of the world, and there were women on this side, and there was kind of this bright dividing line
yeah,
between people who are men and people who are women. And that I come to think of as gender only feminism. It
yeah,
was very important to me in the late 80s and early 90s to sort of have a clarity about, what we at the time called patriarchy, just sort of the dominance of male power in this society. But the problem with that is it sets us off on a path that doesn't lead anywhere useful, right? Because if you start out on the path of gender only feminism, then you don't get to ask other questions, which you get to ask with intersectional feminism, right? And the
yeah,
intersectional feminist approach is always asking about race and about class at the same time as asking about gender. So I think it just gives us a much, richer and truer vision of the world when we
yeah.
look at all those dimensions at once.
I think that's really interesting, though, this to frame it that way, where by taking these other things into account, you get to ask those questions. It's not,
Yeah,
oh, and then we have to think about these, you know,
right.
these types of people in that situation and
Mm-hmm,
whatever.
mm-hmm,
It's
mm-hmm.
about, we get to explore it and find, you know, a solution that
Right.
works for the most people or more people, or, you know,
Right, right.
yeah,
And it also begins to help us interrogate our own experience and our
yeah,
own practices. One of the great insights of intersectional feminism is that lived experience matters. And I think so many times for those of us who are raised to be white and who are gendered femme, that we often ignore the way that race has shaped our lives. So that's part of the invitation of this book is like,
yeah.
let's figure this out.
Yeah, and it, I mean, for people who haven't read it, the invitation is there, and I really appreciate it being so open and so obvious. I want to just, before I get to the next topic, I want to say to the people watching at home, there will be some time for audience questions. So use the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of your screen, and while you're there, you can vote on which questions you want to have Jessie answer. Um, and I will make that plea again. But we have, you know, about 20 more minutes of me, and then we can really turn it to the audience. Um, so one of the first topics you deal with, right off the top, is Karens. It feels like a concept that, you know, felt very familiar when it started getting talked about. It may
Mhm,
have been there
mhm,
for quite a while, but really has become
mhm,
part of the daily vernacular, particularly
mhm,
online, fairly recently.
mhm.
How did this conception of white women become so pervasive so quickly? And how is it also, I mean, I'll just betray my own, you know, internet use, maybe, like, such a good identifier, like so specific, and I know that person, and
Mhm.
I,
Yeah,
like, how did that
yeah.
happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting emergence of this phenomenon, and I think part of what's going on, right, is that we have a really short collective memory these days. So before Karens, there were Beckys, and
Yep.
those sort of got lost by the wayside. But I think part of what's going on is that there's actually a real movement among people who have been victims of racial oppression to not take it anymore, and they all have cell phones. So, I mean, I think
Yeah.
part of what's happening is
Yeah.
that white women's bad behavior, which, in my estimation, has been going on for a long time, but now it's being captured on cell phones and then posted to social media.
Sure.
And so that creates a kind of pushback, and people like wonderful scholars like April Williams and Andre Brock have talked about sort of the Karen phenomenon and have studied it from a digital culture perspective. But part of what I think is going on is that actually this subject position, a term that we use in academia, but that what it means to be a white woman is actually now, instead of just being assumed to be kind of innocent and more beautiful than everyone else and in need of protection, these Karen memes are really a challenge to that mythology of white women, and it's really kind of exposing kind of the underbelly of what it means to be a white woman. It's sort of like saying, here you go, this is what you look like when you call the manager, when you call 911. We're seeing you and we're calling you on that. And really what I'm doing in the book is not so much a calling out of Karens, but a kind of invitation for all of us who are raised to be white and gendered femme to sort of look at ourselves and say, why is this the moment when we're being sort of pilloried as Karens? What's going on, that's making that happen? And I think the other thing that's happening is that there's a real shift in kind of the popular culture around what it means to be a white woman. So it can be, it can be a kind of uncomfortable moment to be a white woman. And that can shade over into, real misogyny and hatred of women. There was a stand-up comedian, Bill Burr, who was on Saturday Night Live last year in 2020. And his monologue opening the show was very funny, and he had a little riff on white women. And then, and I was laughing along with it. And then it comes the point where he says, to his address is to a white woman, he says, so just sit down and shut up next to me. I'm like, no.
Yeah.
And that was when I gave Bill Burr my big middle finger feminist salute. I think that though there is this way in which the Karen memes can shade over into a kind of misogyny and a kind of ageism, because I think there's something about age going on there as well. But I think if we get stuck in that sort of, oh, that's just misogyny, then we're making that mistake of gender only feminism, when we're not paying attention to the kind of bigger story here, which is really about race and about, what the kind of power that white women have in this society.
Yeah. And I think you also do a really good job of not just giving up on Karens, right? And you implicate so many people who wouldn't necessarily identify themselves that way or wouldn't see themselves in those memes. They would say, I'd never ask for the manager. I'm very careful never to call the police. But you write this book to every white woman, right? Republican women, white women who didn't attend college, Democratic women who did attend college, anyone in between and on either side of those. And you discuss how these tendencies or biases are ingrained in people across many different lines. How tricky was that to kind of do in a book like this? And why was it so important to you to make sure all of your readers saw themselves in your book?
Yeah, well, I mean, I want to say, I had really great editorial help to sort of keep me focused on that. At Field Press, I worked with Emmy Akandi, and at on my own, I worked with an editor named Tony Amato, and both of them were great and sort of, keeping me focused on sort of the widest possible reach for this book. And part of that is really staying true to my own values as an intersectional feminist, sort of trying to think across the complexities of whiteness, the different class positions, different political positions, I'm really trying to talk about this identity of white womanhood across lots of different other axes, as we might say. So that was just really important to me as a way of calling in, as a way of an invitation as well, because it just seemed to me it's kind of an easy thing to do, to sort of riff on white women who vote for the GOP or whatever. Like, but that's a point that's been made and not so interesting after a while.
Yeah, and it becomes a wedge, right? And
Right.
this book does not feel
Exactly.
like a wedge. It feels like a real. The invitation is a great word. I mean, it definitely
Right.
it reads that way, and it invites so many people in. Um, One of the things you do, I think, pretty well, and I want to get to a specific question about it, but
Hmm.
you do focus on conclusions and solutions and
Hmm.
next steps. I think I ask a question that is not necessarily just about the book, but how do we as a culture not write off the Karens, or not write off, maybe we can just say like more broadly, like suburban white women,
Hmm.
when we see these election results that largely are swayed by the vagaries of this
Yeah.
voting bloc. We saw it in 2016. We saw it then swing back in 2020, and just this last month
Hmm.
in Virginia and many elections across the country, we may
Yeah.
have seen another shift. And so, I think many people on both sides can be frustrated that, maybe they're
Hmm.
changing their minds or whatever. How do we kind of bring them into whichever fold we're coming from, and try
Yeah.
to include them?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, people who work in politics have got to work on their messaging. I mean, I think that's one of the big things that's been wrong. And I think sometimes the political messaging does that sort of distancing and dumping and giving up on people. And I just think it's not a smart strategy politically. But I think that really part of the key is going to be tapping into people's, the better angels of people's nature. And I think for a lot of white women, that comes when around the role of caretaker and an often mother, and that's part of what's been weaponized. We saw this a lot in Virginia, the
Sure.
whole sort of, oh, this is threatening our
Education and yep.
children and that sort of thing. And I think part of what's going on is that there's such um, a narrow circle of who we're taught to care about, right? It's just the people in our
Very,
nuclear family.
yeah.
And part of the things that I advocate for in the conclusion is to what I call expand our circle of caring, right? Really, really expand the notion of who it is that we care most about in the world, and really reimagine our kinship ties so that it's not
Yeah.
just the little nuclear family that we're trying to, stab each other to get the last morsels of social resources for. But we're really thinking collectively, like, how do we make things better for more people, for everyone, even?
Yeah, I mean, you talk about that at length, about the concept of the nuclear family being a very powerful, unrecognized tool for white supremacy. Anyone can look at a billboard from the '50s and see mom and dad and the two kids in the back of the station wagon,
Mm-hmm.
and then that becomes like
Yeah.
everyone's ideal.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
One of the options you offer is the idea of a chosen family. I think many people who
Mm-hmm.
celebrate Friendsgiving with anybody
Mm-hmm.
understand what
Yeah.
that means. But do you have anything that speaks to people who maybe have a more traditional nuclear family but aren't
Mm-hmm.
committed to, what they want to break down that edifice? They want to kind of change
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important things, excuse me, I think one of the most important things that people that maybe come from a more traditional family or cultural milieu is to think about where they're spending their time. I mean, one of the things I advocate for is think about, excuse me, taking an inventory of where we're spending our time, our energy, and our money. And if that's only going to white only institutions or predominantly white institutions, start to rethink that. And I
Mm-hmm.
think in terms of families, especially white families, thinking about where their money goes. Are you, part of the reason that we have a wealth gap in this culture, in this country, is that so much of our wealth comes from housing, and that's unequal. You don't have to read very far into the literature
Right.
about race and
Yeah.
economics to understand that most of our wealth comes from housing. And I would just urge people in white families to reconsider that sort of default handing down that advantage to their children. Because if you're handing down, an unequal advantage in wealth to your children, then you're part of the problem. Um, you're reinventing white supremacy for the next generation if you're doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a very powerful concept. I think that, we have, you talk about the compounding effect. You have a wage gap,
Hmm.
then you have a wealth gap, then you have
Yeah,
generational wealth, and then you have generation
yeah.
inequity, and
Hmm.
inequality, um, and then you're fighting against this American mythology of,
Right.
um, building wealth and passing it down to your kids, and,
Hmm.
I'm gonna
Hmm.
do such a great job, my grandchildren won't have to work, kind of a,
Hmm.
everybody wants to be a Rockefeller. So, are there specific strategies that you would advocate for people? I own my own home. My parents own their own home. They definitely helped me get into my home, both
Hmm.
financially, and my mother's a realtor, so I had a
Hmm.
number of
Yeah.
advantages right off the bat. Um,
Hmm.
so how can I, or how can my wife, my white woman wife, avoid reinforcing those systems? Still feel like we're taking care of our daughter, but um,
Yeah.
you know, begin like
Yeah. I
actually begin to break it
don't.
down.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not advocating that anybody should go without or not have enough, but if you have enough,
Yeah, I
then
was gonna say
um,
there are many people who
yeah,
don't have enough and are going without.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. No, I'm not harshing on them. I'm just saying
yeah, yeah,
for everyone else who has enough and has a surplus that they are
yeah,
sort of automatically thinking, I'm gonna pass this on to my kids. Reconsider that. What is there a racial justice organization that you could pass that wealth on
yeah,
to instead of your children, right? I mean, it's like this contradiction that we have in the United States. Like on the one hand, we sort of deeply believe or tell ourselves that we believe in this meritocracy where we think anyone can make it, and yet we in
yeah.
white families are like gunning for sort of providing our kids with kind of a little edge up on that
Sure.
meritocracy in case the whole meritocracy thing doesn't work out,
In case that was
So,
just bogus, which is a
yeah,
different book. We
exactly.
had that book 2 years ago at the Wisconsin Book Festival. It's called The Meritocracy Trap. You can look it up.
Excellent. But yeah, I mean, it's like, well, if it's a meritocracy, then your kids should be okay, right?
Yeah,
So it's just another way. I mean, I just think we have to think about what our defaults are,
yeah.
and including when it comes to money. Like, what are the default ways that we're spending our money and investing our money? And are there other ways that we could do that that would help unwind this? I mean, it's certainly a generational effort to try and undo white supremacy, but it's
Yeah.
very much a system that we've created and that we as white women are helping to co-create, and if we can just step back from those defaults, I think we can start to unwind it.
As you talk about that, it occurs to me many of my jobs have been in nonprofits and this kind of charitable giving
Mm-hmm.
world that has been created. Like, not that there weren't charities 50 years ago, but in the last 30
Mm-hmm.
years, the nonprofit world, 501c3
Mm-hmm.
nonprofits, have really
Yep.
become a huge force in our economy, and they are largely
Mm-hmm.
run by white women.
Yep.
And part of the deal with that is a way to be philanthropic, and
Mm-hmm.
also, you know there's some status that goes along with it, there's some society that
Mm-hmm.
goes along with going to those galas, or
Mm-hmm.
giving money, or receiving money.
Mm-hmm.
So have you done any research into the white women's role in philanthropy, and being the gatekeepers of charity?
Yeah, I mean, there's a tremendous. I see that as a real tremendous opportunity in a way, really, because there is this kind of cultural power and social power that white women are very much in charge of. It's in publishing too, by the way.
Oh yeah.
But all these
Yes, I
publishing,
do.
philanthropy, lots of different sectors where it's really white women who are in charge of those, and they're often cultural ones, right? It's not the big money places often, but it's the
Sure.
cultural places.
Yep.
And I just think that if the white women in those roles could begin to rethink their own um, function in supporting, the system of white supremacy, that it could really change things. I mean, there's been some shift in philanthropy. There's an excellent book by Edgar Villanueva who talks about transforming philanthropy in a way that really honors, the people who built this country, Black people, Latino people, Indigenous people, and really sort of values their contributions and focuses philanthropy on giving back to those communities and really investing in them in a particular way, rather than just, doing this sort of cosmetic or window dressing sort of work. There have also been really wealthy women who have donated significant amounts to racial justice organizations, and I think that as a model of philanthropy is sort of an interesting one to think about, but it's certainly not the majority of what's happening in philanthropy right now.
Yeah, that's interesting. I just want to make sure you said it's Edgar Villanueva's. Is it Decolonizing Wealth? Is that what
Yes.
he's
Thank you.
talking
Yeah,
about?
that's
Great.
the title.
I'm just gonna put that
Yeah.
in the chat for everybody.
It's a terrific book. I really recommend it.
Because that feels very powerful. Sorry, it's hard to do both things. I'm usually just
Thanks for accessing that part of my brain.
Thanks for everybody bearing with me while I type in the chat. One of the other things, it's interesting you talk about the people who built this country and them not being recipients of the kind of credit for that, or the money that goes along with that. One of the other ways that you discuss whiteness kind of being most prominent publicly in America right now is through the wellness community. Instagram influencers, fitness, mindfulness, yoga, just Gwyneth Paltrow writ large. And how, like yoga is a great example, mindfulness and meditation, if I just got on Instagram and I didn't know, I would think white women invented meditation for sure. But can you talk a bit about how white women and race pervades these images and these movements and manages to do so without necessarily ever being the focal point, without being discussed?
Right. Yeah, it's such an interesting phenomenon, this whole rise of the wellness industry. And I think one of the important things to point out is that this is a billion with a B, $billion business. And it's primarily white women that it's both targeted to and who are spending, the majority of those billions of dollars. And I think there are several things going on here, but one of them is, there's a kind of cultural appropriation that's happening at sort of a most basic level, right? So yoga is a practice that's connected with the Hindu religious tradition. It's invented by a brown man in India. And by the time it comes to the United States, all that stuff is, all those cultural markers are stripped off of it, right? And it's just a practice of, as you say, if you go on Instagram, you would think white women invented it, right? And most of those spaces end up being all white women spaces, right? The actual yoga studios and that sort of thing. Yeah. So it reinforces a kind of whiteness in gathering, right? In gathering in those spaces. But there's something else going on, a little more nuanced that I was trying to get at with the wellness stuff, which is that there's a way in which white women, again, it's getting to this sort of idea of a subject position, like who we are in this culture. I think there's something that the wellness industry does both to kind of shore up this nice white lickety identity, like, you need extra care because you're a nice white lady. But I also think that there is something about this structural position where we have this kind of provisional power when it comes to white men. Like, we definitely have less power than they do, but we're often, in powerful positions over other people, perhaps,
right.
Young children or people of color who are like people who are managing at work, that sort of thing. And I think that takes a toll, that kind of managing up and managing down and sort of figuring out, what it means to be a white woman in this culture. I think it does take a toll, but there's this whole billion-dollar industry to help us make us feel better about that identity at the same time. So
it also
really
models a concept of what it means to be well, right? To be a certain weight and a certain, have blonde hair and to wear the right boots and all of those things that are unattainable for certain people who just, my skin doesn't look like that, or I'm not that size or whatever. But it also continues to center women. You talk about this, it center women as this beautiful ideal and
it definitely reinforces all those appearance related, attributes that second wave feminism was all about trying to smash. It sort of reinforces all of those under the guise of wellness. At the same time, it's totally distracting us from things like carcinogens in the environment, which are actually making us
anything.
unwell.
You can
So
just
it's
pick
like,
up your phone
don't,
and
yeah,
be distracted.
you know, like don't pay attention to that. Just,
Yeah.
do some more yoga and you'll be fine.
Yeah, or watch her do yoga. It's even better. You don't have to do the yoga; she's doing it for you. It's so great.
Or take a detox bath, whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, or sit in your bath and watch her do yoga.
Right.
That's perfect.
It's really all about buying something though, right? In
It is
the
all
end,
about
it
buying
ends up being, it's just retail therapy, really.
That's exactly right. So I do want to. We do have one or two questions in the chat, but I have a couple more questions, and then we're going to go to the audience. So
Okay.
if you're watching at home,
Great.
please ask your questions. One of the other things that really comes away in your book is this. I'm not going to make you read the paragraph, but for those of you reading at home, it's on page 119. But you talk about shame in this very interesting and nuanced way, multiple types of shame, and you talk about how as people learn the history of this country or they learn about present day atrocities, there's a natural reaction that is shame, and it can be positive. It can be motivating. I don't want to see that. I don't want to be that kind of a person.
Right.
There's also a version of it that can lead to a toxic response, to a real the kind of response Brene Brown talks about a lot, where it's like anger and pushback and kind of lashing out. So what advice do you have for people who are learning about these things, who want some ways to get better, and ways that we can deal with that shame in a positive way that motivates people to make positive changes that matter?
Yeah, I think I so appreciate you pulling out that that passage in the book, because I think it's so important for understanding the moment that we're in right now with all the, like, I think about the legislation, and I think it's now 27 states where they've passed legislation against having this conversation about critical race theory, which absolutely is not being taught in K through 12, or even undergraduate college. But I think that that kind of move, sort of like, this is going to be uncomfortable and so we're going to push it away, is really about forestalling. It's like keeping at bay those feelings of shame. And I just think they're a natural response to hearing about genocide and atrocities. Like, absolutely, we should feel ashamed when we learn those things about our culture. And in my case, my actual ancestors who were involved in those kinds of things, in order to, in some ways, just to make the point again, to make my life better. Like, I found out when I was writing this book, my grandfather had been in the Klan, that kind in the 1920s, and that kind of violent extremism is really about securing the nation for white people, and it was really for his granddaughter that he was doing that.
Right,
So I think that learning about that kind of shameful history is absolutely something that should fill us with shame. But we have to metabolize it. We have to find a way to discharge it rather than holding on to it. And so I think that one way that people who don't know how to metabolize shame do is they push it away at the outset. Like, I'm going to deny this. I'm going to not have this conversation. I don't want to think about it at all. But if we can be mature enough to understand, oh, right, that's shameful, and I have some connection to that, I've got to find a way to metabolize that and move beyond it, then you can get to this healthier shame, which is, right, that happened, it doesn't define who I am, and how do we repair the damage of that?
I think that's, the not being defined by it is a really important thing. There are going to be, going back even to your earlier statement about we need to find a place where we can deal with our own whiteness and have these conversations. Like, we're going to make mistakes. We're gonna not think. We're gonna think we're doing the thing right, and we're not going to. And so you need to maintain that openness and maintain that level of saying, like, I'm not gonna just be defined by this one moment or this one reaction or this one experience or by your grandfather's experience, right? It's both things. We are getting toward the end, and I really found it interesting that you ended each section of your book with a conclusion, and then you ended the whole book with a section that you called conclusion. And so often we do a lot of nonfiction book events, and a lot of the time you get to the end and that climate change is a problem, but all you know is it doesn't really matter if you recycle, and no one focuses on solutions. So, but you do. And so I was wondering if you have a few conclusions or solutions that are your favorites and that you really want to share with people if they're, they're, getting this book this way first. What should they be looking out for, and what can they do to?
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I have to, again, I need to shout out my editor at Silk Press, India Condit, who really insisted on conclusions and solutions in this book. I was very much in the sociological mode of just going, it's problematic.
Yeah,
and
here's
scene.
the data.
And she was like,
you can
nope.
see, yeah.
You need to keep going. So yeah, I appreciate the challenge of thinking through those things. And I really tried to make them connected to the earlier arguments that I make in the book. So do I have a favorite one? I mentioned earlier the idea of taking an inventory, and I think for a lot of people who are raised to be white, I think that taking an inventory of where we spend our time, money, and energy can be really a fruitful exercise.
And you mean like write it down?
Yeah, no, like start keeping a log,
yeah.
like a time diary of where you're spending every single day. And I think that can be a super important kind of entry into thinking about, oh, right, my whole life is in white only spaces. How do I change that up? So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing, going back to our conversation earlier about, professions that are dominated by mostly white women, I think about librarians. And one of my dreams would be to have all the librarians in the country start doing information sessions for people who come through their libraries about how to do genealogical research that sort of uncovers some of these unfair advantage things, like deed restrictions. Like, did you grow up in a house where your parents, there was a deed restriction on that house, meaning they couldn't sell it when they were ready to move? They couldn't sell it to somebody who wasn't white, and doing those kinds of things. So those are some of my ideas, and I have lots of others.
I'm going to connect you with some librarians, I think. That sounds...
that's great. I look forward to it. One other thing I just wanted to say, just thinking about the shame conversation, because some of this can be so hard and difficult for white people who are not used to this kind of work. I really encourage people at the very end to find some kind of a spiritual practice that helps them connect to other people who are doing this work, and connects them in love to other people, because it's rough work. I mean, I have spent the last few days watching 2 different trials of white supremacists, and it's really rough, at the end of that day. So I think you need to have some kind of, whatever it is, whether it's going to a concert or going roller skating or finding an actual church or synagogue or mosque, but finding some way that you can sort of discharge that negative energy. Super important.
Yeah, that is. I mean, it is powerful, and it is so easy to not even want to turn on the radio or TV and learn about those things. So, having a good way to deal with that at the end of it is important, and then we'll allow you the space to come back and not ignore it tomorrow, right?
Exactly. Keep going.
Additionally important. So I'm gonna ask a couple of questions from the audience here.
Great.
Marcia says there are books like Witnessing Whiteness and White Fragility, or maybe even White Rage, that seem to deal with similar topics. How do you see your book in conversation with other books on these similar topics? Or
wonderful.
Yeah.
Great question, Marcia. Thank you so much for that. I'm definitely in conversation with those other books. I think what is different about this book is I really try and put myself into the book, and include a lot of my, my own personal story, so kind of memoir-ish writing. And part of that is not to center myself or to be self-aggrandizing, but it's to, as an early reader of the book said, it's written as a gentle double dare. And that's sort of how I feel about it. Like I've written it as...
That's a nice reader that you have. That's a good way of
putting
that. Yeah.
It's a very good reader. It's a way to say, here's what I've done. This is my contribution here. Now, what are you going to do? So I really, I feel like it's different in that way. And and I really put my own story in it, which I don't know that those other books do as much.
Yeah. No, I think that is something that is definitely unique to this book, which is you say, here I am. I'm a nice white lady, and here are
Yeah.
the complications and struggles that I've
Yeah.
had, and here's what I've learned and how it's changed me. And I think
Hmm.
just seeing that progression in anyone then
Hmm.
provides a roadmap to someone else who might say,
Right.
"Oh, okay, well, I'm reading these same statistics.
Yeah.
Maybe that'll change me too."
Yeah.
Um, Anne in Delafield asks, what was the aha moment that made you start dealing with racism at all? As a
Mm.
white woman in academia, there aren't a lot of
Yeah.
outside pressures that say, "Hey, Jesse, study this." So, what was the?
Right. I have to say, I mentioned a little bit about my father,
Yeah.
but and his belief that he was Cherokee. But he was also he was. I was super close to him when I was growing up, and he was very much, the person who helped interpret the world for me. And kind of the whole civil rights movement was happening outside our house, and then kind of came through the television in a way. And he would talk to the
Okay.
television and talk to me about what was happening in the world. And I just really think those conversations with him when I was a little kid just got me thinking about race in a particular kind of way that I was just really curious about it.
Interesting.
And then when I went to graduate school, I was lucky enough to knock on the door of Joe Fagan, who was a professor at UT Austin, and he's one of the leading experts in race. And I ended up studying with him, so that was really it. And I think to sort of narrow it down, my aha moment when I began to read about race was really those two books I mentioned already, the Custer Died for Your Sins by Vandaluria, who used to work at the Bureau of Indian Affairs and is Native American himself, and then Ida B. Wells Barnett's Red Record. And in both of those, there were glimpses where I could sort of see myself as a white woman. It was like very confusing and troubling. I was like, oh, so it's taken me a minute to figure all that out. A minute being a couple of decades, but it's taken me a while to figure all that out.
Oh, it doesn't just solve itself overnight, huh? Okay.
Right.
Well, you heard it here first. No, that is really great. I mean, being able to see yourself in that is a really
Mm-hmm.
wonderful first step, right? I mean, you can't,
Mm-hmm.
otherwise
Right.
there's no empathy,
Right.
right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
so we have a question that kind of goes back to our discussion of passing down generational wealth, and
Mm-hmm.
um, KRD says, when you talk about giving away surplus money, how do you think about it, and how do you like wrap your mind around it? I think is what they mean. Given the lack of a social safety net in the United States, or the eroding
Yeah. Yeah.
social safety net, like
Well, right. I mean that's where we are though, right? Is that
yeah,
is your our social safety net now is you better pick good parents, you know?
have rich
It's
parents. That's
like
a great one.
I think we're at the end of that as a sustainable kind of system.
Yeah,
We've got to think about building a safety net for all of us,
yeah,
so that it's not this kind of Game of Thrones battle to the death over generational wealth and who's got it to pass on to their kids. I mean, it's just ugly when we do it that way. It's better if we
yeah,
have a social safety net for everyone.
yeah. No, I think that's right. And I think to to answer the question, even though I'm definitely not a subject matter expert, I think finding a way that you can use the resources you have to help build that social safety net that will
Yeah,
benefit you and will benefit your children and will
exactly.
benefit other people and their children.
Yeah,
That's the really powerful way to do it,
yeah,
and to access those avenues that we all have, right? Or that some of us have, not that we all have, but
right, right,
that any of us
right.
have. So final question is, in addition to conclusions, you really leave people, in addition to read Jessie Daniels, because she is the subject matter expert. Please click this green button, and buy a copy of Nice White Ladies today. Supply chain problems are real, so buy one to give to somebody for the holidays. Maybe there's a nice white lady in your life that needs to read this book. But you talk about other people that we should go out and who are leading the charge in many ways on these issues. And so I think if we have a couple minutes, if you would leave us with some other people in addition to Jessie Daniels, who you can find on all the platforms, who should we be thinking about looking at and following maybe?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, I've been following a couple of these trials, and right now, my one of my heroes is I'm going to pronounce her last name wrong, but Amy Spadlnick, I think is how she says her last name. She's the lead attorney in Charlottesville, who is bringing this civil case against the neo-Nazis
Yeah.
who organized the Unite the Right rally there, and I just admire her so, and just think that she's one of the people who's using her time to help dismantle white supremacy. So
Yeah, that's interesting.
I just donated to them, and I encourage other people to donate. Our organization is called, I think it's Integrity for America is the organization that's bringing the lawsuit, and I think they're doing great work, and it's several white women who are the lead of that organization. So
All right.
I get my
I think
vote
it's
today.
called Integrity First for America.
Oh, thank you. Yes,
Yeah,
Integrity
and
First.
I'm doing this again where I'm looking at the internet while
Sorry, I'm just
no, it's
throwing
fine.
things out for you to Google.
No, it's fine. Yeah, so I'll put that in the chat for people as well. And I encourage people, find your leader, find the person whose take on these issues really speaks to you, and push yourself. There are many of them. I think having a hero who is an attorney, a civil rights attorney, is probably more in line with what we should be doing than the yoga person that I can watch in my bathtub. But thank you, Jessie, so much. Thank you for this hour. Thank you for this book.
Yeah, this is
it
great.
has been an absolute pleasure talking to you tonight. This event will be available as a replay immediately following the event. So if you want to share it with somebody who wasn't here tonight that you think needs to hear Jessie's message, and again, buy Jessie's book, you will be able to do that immediately following the event tonight. Jessie, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And for those of you at home, we appreciate you being here, and we hope to see you at another book festival again soon. Good night.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.